Hey there, welcome to YouTube. If you are into poetry, if you are into literature, if you are into cultural history, then you've come to the right place. Cardboard Box Productions makes podcasts about all those things, so be sure to click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so that you never miss a new episode. Obviously, we mostly make podcasts, so you can also go to anywhere you get your podcasts, if it's a place other than YouTube, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and you can subscribe to our podcast feeds there. All right, I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to Close Talking, the world's most popular poetry analysis podcast from Cardboard Box Productions Incorporated. I am co-host Jack Rossiter Munley, and with my good friend Connor McNamara Stratton, we read a poem,
talk about the poem,
and read the poem again.
Before we get into today's selection, a quick note that if you like what we do here at Close Talking and have a spare minute of your time, it would mean the world to us if you would give the podcast a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Those ratings and reviews help boost us up the algorithm and find new listeners.
And if you have suggestions for future episodes or comments on this one, you can send us an email at closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com.
And you can also find us on social media. On Twitter, the show is @CloseTalking. I am @Jack Rossiter Munn, and Connor is @Connor M. Stratton. On Instagram, the show is @CloseTalkingPoetry, and on Facebook, it's facebook.com/CloseTalking. We also have a website, closetalking.com, where you can find all the past episodes of the show, and Cardboard Box Productions has just launched a newsletter, Unboxed, and if you go to cardboardboxproductionsinc.com, you can subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stuff on Close Talking and all of the other literary and cultural history podcasts that Cardboard Box Productions makes. On with the show.
Hello and welcome to an all-new episode of Close Talking. I am your co-host from the East Coast, Jack Rossiter Munley.
And I am your co-host from the Third Coast, the Midwest, the greatest region of the country and the world, Connor McNamara Stratton.
It's definitely a region of the country.
All right. Jack is from Illinois, as am I, and that constitutes a huge betrayal of his loyalties. But it's not to be. I mean, we all expect it. You go to New York, you have a lot of fun, you're surrounded by interesting people, you see the best music that exists, and you think, oh, New York is all there is. It's all you need. It's all you've got. But
there was also that hilarious time in the early 90s when I was born in Albany.
All right. This is a bunch of technicalities masquerading as a rebuttal.
I'm not saying that New York is better. I'm just not sure that the Midwest is the best. I mean, everywhere's got its qualities, you know?
Oh, okay. All right. I
would point you to the Bob Seger song Kathmandu, where he lists many different qualities of different parts of the United States.
Okay. I'll give that a listen and get back to you.
I've got no kick against the southern states. Every time I've been there, it's been great.
That's a great line.
Travel to the East Coast. You want people? They got the most. We are here to talk. This is somewhat appropriate. We are here to talk about something musical that takes place in New York City, because we are talking about Mary Karr's poem, Carnegie Hall Rush Seats.
Yes, I'm very excited about this one.
I am too. I really like when poetry and music are in conversation with each other in all the different ways that happens. Before we do the poem, Mary Karr, pretty well known. She is a prominent memoirist, essayist, and poet. She rose to prominence in 1995 with the publication of her book, The Liars Club, which was a memoir about her early and very difficult life. And she followed that up with a couple of other really excellent memoirs, Cherry, a memoir, and Lit, a memoir. Lit dealt with her struggles with alcoholism as an adult and her recovery from that, and also her eventual discovery of religion, which was something kind of new and different for her in her adult life. And she's somebody who speaks really interestingly and movingly about her relationship with religion and prayer and poetry. So I highly recommend checking out some of her essays on that subject. It's really good stuff. Her most recent book of poetry came out in, wait for it, 2018. And it is called,
God.
I know. She's still writing all kinds of great work. But her latest collection, Tropic of Squalor from HarperCollins, came out this year.
And this poem was published in the New Yorker in 2017.
Carnegie Hall Rush Seats by Mary Karr. Whatever else the orchestra says, the cello insists, you're dying. It speaks from the core of the tree's hacked out heart, shaped and smoothed like a woman. Be glad you are not hard wood yourself and can hear it. Every day, the cello is taken into someone's arms, taken between spread legs and lured into its shivering. The arm saws, and all the sacred cries of saints and demons issue from the carved cleft holes. Like all of us, it aches, sending up moans from the pit we balance on the edge of.
This is a good one.
Yeah. The minute that I read it, I instantly was like, oh, we got to talk about this. And I didn't even really realize why, because I've since had a lot of more thoughts that I didn't have the first time I read it. The first time I read it, my thought that I wrote down on my sheet here was just cellos are sexy. And that was it. And I have since dug deeper into the poem. As usual, I think this poem doesn't need it as much as most, but our quick little narrative overlay is basically rush seats are when you get last minute cheap tickets to a concert or to, it comes up more often, I think, with Broadway plays, but they're like leftover tickets, or sometimes you can sign up for like a ticket lottery and then you get these like last minute seats to go see something cool. And so this is kind of about the unexpected, I guess, joy of getting to go to one of these concerts at Carnegie Hall. You get the idea that there's an orchestra playing, whatever else the orchestra says, the cello insists you're dying. So you have an orchestra playing, and then this sort of seems to me like the thoughts of someone watching, I guess, like the cello's solo piece or like moment within the larger piece of music. It felt like the cello got featured at some point, and this is like reflections on that moment.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, I love this poem. It's like, first of all, the beginning is amazing. I wish I had written that. Whatever else the orchestra is saying, the cello insists you're dying. That's so good.
Gets you hooked.
It gets you hooked. Because it's like, I love the idea. It just sort of brings you in immediately, like you're sort of part of a conversation that's already happening, you know. But then the casualness that leads into the total gravity of what the cello is saying. You know, whatever else the orchestra says, it's like blah, blah, blah. But then it's like a great move because it's already the sort of the idiom of the whatever else this says. But that's like personifying the orchestra as like a kind of, you know, bunch of talking heads or something. Which is like such a cool way to think about a bunch of instruments. And then the cello's just there being like, you're dying, which is so intense. But I think, you know, really gets at, like, immediately sets the stakes, you know, and it's kind of, you know, on one level, it's a poem about how transformative and sort of ecstatic music can make you feel. I feel like that's the kind of like the basic thing behind it. And in that way, it is similar to, we talked about on an earlier episode, Ada Limone's one about Aretha Franklin. What was that called again?
Some of Your Love with Me.
Some of Your Love with Me, which was a similar kind of speaker who's like being totally transfixed and then transformed by the song. Yeah, but I at the same time, this one goes in a totally different direction, and feels like pretty distinct. And I know that you had gravitated toward both of those poems. I'm curious, what comparisons you had between those. Yeah, and like what about this one felt distinct?
Before I answer that quickly, I wanted to say that I like that you brought up the way that the orchestra is personified, because it also not only then personifies the cello, but intensely humanizes it, which then kind of moves through the rest of the poem. Yeah. So not coincidentally, I also picked that Ada Limon poem, and there are some definite similarities, but whereas that felt like an individual in conversation with another person they were experiencing through their music, and they were reflecting on the intensity of that, this felt more like a person being just affected by music itself and by an instrument rather than focusing on another human being. So it's not about the performer, it's about the cello. It's not about the lyrics of a song or, the words. It's about this piece of, probably orchestral music. There's an orchestra playing it. So that to me felt a little bit different. And then the way that the direction of the reflection that the individual offers who is experiencing the music isn't so much about herself, it's about the experience of taking the dead wood of an instrument and filling it with so much vibrancy and life, and using that as a means of transferring emotion and really getting swept up in the emotions that what are fundamentally, a tree's hacked out heart that has been smoothed. It's like dead wood, but it's alive, and in many instances it speaks.
Yeah, I really like that. That seems really right. One thing that it also makes me think of is like, it's not just about, one could write a poem like, oh, this song was so good, it made me so happy, it filled me with so many feelings, blah, blah, blah. But from the outset, the cello is insisting that you're dying. And there's something about this that actually makes me think of, if we want to take a little trip down literary lane.
I would love to do that because I have a detour along a similar country road planned for a little later on in this episode. So Let's do it.
Well, be careful, because my literary lane is on a high peak overlooking a vast expanse that is alternately beautiful and terrifying.
Is that the same one that has been painted and put on many covers of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein?
Probably. Okay, so now that I've exhausted my very poor little metaphorical landscape, I feel like this poem is talking about something that's similar to the idea of the sublime, in sort of capital R romantic art and also philosophy, and also literature. And the idea of the sublime and also the idea of terror. Because one thing that's interesting to me about this poem is it not just the you're dying part, but then there's the part at the end where the arms sawing and sawing, and it's not just the sacred cries of saints, but it's also the demons that are sort of issuing from the carved cleft holes. And that idea of both the demons and the saints seems really important to this poem. And so in sort of the Romantic era, so Romanticism, which was like, at least in England, was, I think, largely in the 1800s. One of its big ideas was the idea of the sublime. The philosopher Edmund Burke actually talked about the sublime, and he sort of talked about it. He said, quote, It's an experience that excites the ideas of pain and danger, that produces, quote, the strongest emotion that the mind is capable of feeling. And it's really interesting to me because, when I first learned about it, there's this painting, which is like sort of like what I always associate with the sublime and romanticism. It's called Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. We'll link to it. It's by Caspar David Friedrich. So it's this guy that could either be, he looks very like he looks like he could go swashbuckling, or he could recite Shakespeare. He's got a nice little sword at his side. He's got a sharp coat, the black boots, etc. And he's standing on this like big rocky precipice, looking out over these clouds, and this sort of huge landscape. And one thing that's striking about it is that on the one hand, it is beautiful. It's amazing in the kind of simple, like, holy crap, that's crazy. But it's also like terrifying in both the new sense of the word, but also like the old sense of the word, which is like, it's kind of scary. Like there's a sort of sense of threat that's there. Like you could be swallowed up by the sea of fog. You're like right before, you're right before like a huge abyss, or the great unknown in this kind of way. But it's this kind of terror in the old sense, and I think Jack has the physical, possibly the last physical copies of the Oxford English Dictionary in his apartment. So if you could read for us the great definition of both, I think, sublime, but also terror.
Yeah. So sublime has a bunch of definitions. The one that is operating here is in the Oxford English Dictionary, the 7th, which is of things in nature and art affecting the mind with a sense of overwhelming grandeur or irresistible power, calculated to inspire awe, deep reverence, or lofty emotion by reason of its beauty, vastness, or grandeur.
And so I like connecting this to that because I don't know, it's one of those things that kind of like it had its sort of maybe peak moment in the Romantic era where like a lot of artists and thinkers were like thinking about the turbulent landscape of nature that can do all these crazy things, and sort of this absolute unknown that's like exhilarating and scary at the same time. And and it I think was maybe at its most concentrated articulation during that era, but it's something that I think has sort of continued to this day. And it's something that I think we all experience various forms of. I mean, that's just sort of like where it comes out of, is just like an experience that humans have when we're just confronted by something that's like so amazing, but like also shakes you to the core, in some kind of way that it's not just like good or bad, or it's like life altering. And it's cool to see this poem that's about, at Carnegie Hall 2017, listening to this cello and having this experience that's being described in a way that, feels like the description of the sublime, or a description of sort of terror, being moved by the instrument, but also the instrument's telling you that you're dying. It's that like that the cello saying that seems to be similar to, standing on the edge of this cliff, looking out over this, sea of fog, and being like, death is there, like very close to you. So yeah, I wish I was more of a a scholar on the subject, but I just wanted to bring that in because it felt really relevant for this poem.
Totally. I love all of that. And it's so cool. And I think you're right on, because the stakes are set up right away that this is life and death. Like, you're in this realm of great consequence, even though it's not every day necessarily, but it's it could be a benign or not on that lofty level of a experience of like, yeah, I went to a concert at Carnegie Hall. It was cool. But the setting, perhaps it was unexpected because they're rush seats, but like something made this stand out to this degree. Yeah, I like all of that. I went back a little farther than the Romantic era in my own thoughts on this, because it felt like they're towards the end particularly, but kind of then reflecting back on the rest of the piece, there's this little bit of a religious overlay. You've got the cries of saints and demons issue from the carved cleft holes, which we've talked about a little bit. And I think this is an area where it really diverges from Ada Lamone's poem, where that poem is very much a humanistic connection of an individual to not just another individual, but it's the individual's connection to the piece of work. Whereas this is like bringing up this cosmic overlay, this very religion tinged overlay. And so, particularly because of the way it ended, sending up moans from the pit we balance on the edge of, my immediate thought was Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God by Jonathan Edwards, the famous Calvinist minister who gave that sermon in 1741. And his whole thing is basically, we're all sinners, we're all balanced on the edge of a pit, and left to our own devices, we would all fall in the pit, hell, unless God was there holding us back. And I found a little bit of the sermon, which I thought was appropriate for that little ending piece, which was, then they shall be left to fall as they are inclined by their own weight. God won't hold them up in these slippery places any longer, but will let them go. And then at the very instant they shall fall into destruction, as he that stands in such slippery declining ground on the edge of a pit that he can't stand alone, when he is let go, he immediately falls and is lost. And it felt to me like that was going on a little bit at the end, because you bring in these demons and saints, and we'll circle back to this, but I also feel like there's a little bit of like a sexual temptation thing going on throughout the poem. But that was kind of where I went with the end of it. And thinking along those lines, I was then reading The Arm Saws and all the sacred cries of saints and demons. Put me in mind of the Bernini sculpture, The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, which is this fairly well-known sculpture. I think it gets a shout out in one of Dan Brown's books. But basically, it's about Saint Teresa of Avila, who had a really hot dream about an angel. There's a lot of spear thrusting, and in the sculpture, let's just say you should look it up and decide for yourself whether it is a religious ecstasy, some sort of pain, or something else going on for Saint Teresa with the angel. So that was sort of where I was making connections, not strictly what you were describing, but I feel like it's kind of along the same lines of moving into this really consequential space.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and I think you're right that there's, especially when you were mentioning her book Lit, talking about her own experiences with finding religion and poems as prayers. That sort of confirms that this end. It's not just like a religious undertone. It's like, I mean, we're talking about sacred cries of saints and demons. That's almost as explicit as you can get. And I think that's really right and interesting. And I love the end, and thinking about that pit, which is like such a strange place to end on, I think, but also feels really right. But like the image itself, like all of us, it aches, sending up moans from the pit we balance on the edge of. the moans are very fascinating to me because on the one hand, it's like we're all on the edge of the pit, so we're above the pit, including the cello. And I like one thing that I like a lot is that the cello at the end is connected to us. It's like all of us, it aches, you know. Um, but then the moans are coming from inside, from beneath, you know, from in the pit. It's just interesting because the cello is moaning. There's a pit. I mean, one thing that's very deliberate too is there's, you know, the cello has a hole in it. You know, it's the way that it is made up. It has that kind of it's the hacked out heart of the tree, as Mary Karr says. Um, and you know, the demons are coming from the carved cleft holes. So there's a kind of a pit in the cello itself, which is interesting. Um, and and yet the cello's also, I mean, this is maybe too literal, but it's also outside the pit with us, aching. So I'm like, are we in the pit? Are we out of the pit? I don't really
That's
know where to go with that, but I was having an interesting like a physics problem with where the bones were.
That's interesting. I took it to be that the cello and the we are still separated, and that, like all of us, it aches, and it is sending up moans from the pit that we, not the cello, but we as the listeners, balance on the edge of. And I think that was partially because I was thinking of like an orchestra pit where all of the instruments are in the orchestra pit, and then we in the audience balance on the edge of it, edge of our seats, listening intently.
Oh my God, the orchestra pit. So obvious and yet so profound. Perfect. I didn't even make that connection. I think you're absolutely right. So the pit is that's in that word perfect poetry because it's a great description. It's just the description of where the speaker is. There's the orchestra pit. There's maybe even sitting over it, like if they have the kind of balcony type seats. Um, and yet it has the pit, the kind of either the pit of hell or just a kind of abyss of unknown or death or something like that. Yeah, wow, that's good. I think you're right that they are separate in the we. I think that makes more sense.
But what that last line does contain as a connective tissue is that the cello is like all of us. And so when it's in the pit, it sends up these moans as we might were we to enter into an abyss, not necessarily hell, but just there is a lot of connection there. And I think that's a connection that's been built through the poem where you have the cello insists, so it's already being personified to a degree when it says you're dying. It speaks from the core of the tree's hacked out heart, shaped and smoothed like a woman. So, again, a connection to human beings. Every day, the cello is taken into someone's arms, embraced, taken between spread legs. We can get to that in a minute. But again, a very human description. And so then when that, and also it shivers, it's shivering. And so that's both the resonance of the sound being created, but it's a word that we normally would use just to describe a human being. So I think that that last line is really earned on that level by having laid the groundwork for how human this cello is along the way. And I know that the tone of a cello is also often, because of the range of the notes on it, is often compared to being very human and very much that it has a human-like voice within the orchestra.
And that does remind me one thing that I was so impressed by this poem, and I feel like it's one of its strongest qualities in terms of craft, but also just like um, yeah, why it's so affecting. I think at the end is that, you know, sometimes we talk about how when you're making a kind of metaphor or any kind of image that is going to have like some sort of figurative meaning or connotation attached to it. Um, if you can have the image be like apt, sort of in a literal way, right? Um, but then also have the feeling that's associated in the metaphor be correct. That's like, 101 great poem work. And so this one, what I love is that it takes, one could say, have a poem about the ecstasy that one feels when they're listening to a cello, and just talk about like other random shit. Like, I was listening to a cello, it was like walking down the beach and the moon was shining, and the waves were lapping, and the love of my life was holding my hand, or all that stuff. And obviously that specifically would be terrible, because that's the worst cliche thing that can ever be uttered, but could capture one part of it, which is to say the feeling of it. And so the metaphor might work on that level. But what this poem does is it actually describes how the cello works in a very specific way that is like so cool. One, it starts from actually I just love, it speaks from the core of the tree's hacked out heart, shaped and smooth like a woman. So then we're even talking about the actual material that a cello is made of. It's made from wood, and to get the wood, you gotta, you have to take a tree and you have to hack it up and make it into, form it into this cello, into this shape.
Which in itself is such a particular and human process, because the selection of the trees that make the very best orchestral instruments is really intense. And in fact, all of the instruments that we currently consider to be the best instruments ever were made from trees from like the same area, that were around the same age. And there's like a span of years during which most of these really famous like Stradivariuses and the other couple of like really hot companies from the same small area, it's a span of time when they made all of their multi-million-dollar instruments. And some people theorize it's because there were a few cold summers, I think it was, in a row that like caused the trees to grow in a particular way. There's like all this stuff, but like, wow. Again, it's this very particular natural process that then, even after those trees are harvested, once they are taken by human beings, there's this really, personal handcrafting experience that takes place. You can almost see the B-roll in your head of the crafting, of like the hands working the wood and bending it into shape and smoothing it and putting the finish on it. You can see that slow-mo that we've all seen 100 times in like a woodworking TV show for the Home Gardening Network or something. Like we have this whole idea of what that's about. That's this really personal connection, a window into the natural world and into that unknowable natural grandeur that can bring up exactly what you were talking about as a romantic big R idea of, a connection to a nature that is so vast and beyond us that it creates this sense of sublime terror.
Separately, I want a chef's table for musical instrument makers, because I want that kind of food porn vibe, but just like, yeah, we're just making that cello. And then there's some guy like, from Germany who's speaking very philosophically about, this kind of tree and his childhood with the tree and his very first cello, etc.
I have a musical instrument documentary I saw that's it's not really the same thing, but they do interview this guy who is the warden of a forest and also a poet. There's also this amazing interview with the classical guitarist Segovia, who's like the guy in classical guitaring, where he talks about the guitar.
So I guess it exists, and
not in the form you're talking about, but there are snippets out there that get at this a little bit.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, I think that where Chef's Table might fail is that it knows that that's what it wants to make you feel. And so it's like not an authentic, it's like you're getting all the signs of sublime, but without the sublime itself, perhaps. But I don't know if that's actually true. But it's very you could say that it's contrived in a kind of way.
A little
But
overproduced emptiness, perhaps.
Yeah. At the same time, I mean, the cinematography is beautiful. Oh my God. I want to see those documentaries, but back to the poem. So we talk about the cellist being described in the way it's made, but also the way it's played is very sort of accurate to how you play a cello. Every day the cello is taken into someone's arms, taken between spread legs, and lured into its shivering, right? The arm saws and saws. So those are all just like, that's, when you play the cello, it's a huge instrument. You have to put it in between your legs, and you're kind of like over it, and your arm is, it saws back and forth with the bow on the strings. And and then the sound comes from the holes that are made in the wood of the cello or whatever. And so from those descriptions we get this sense of death, we get this sense of beauty, we get this sense of sex, as you were talking about, the lured into someone's arm, taken between spread legs. It's very sexual. And we get all those feelings that you might associate to having that kind of like amazing musical experience. But instead of just being like, I was walking on the beach, which has nothing to do with the cello, she takes the actual life of a cello and the process of playing a cello and uses sort of those concrete materials to get us to the sort of like the figurative experience, or the metaphorical beauty, or the abstract ideas about it. And that's, I think, the kind of the crux of like how this poem is as good as it is.
Totally agreed.
And it also makes me think, so I mean, we can talk about sex whenever we want. I mean, it's a free country. But
we're adults.
This poem made me think of when we talked about I's poem, I have to stop loving you, so I killed my black goat. But one thing that we talked about that poem was this idea of both the concrete and the abstract, the literal and the figurative, but then also the profane and the sacred, right? And that poem had this kind of grotesqueness to it that was kind of the extreme of the profane, cutting open a goat, etc., that gets you to this like almost sacred or spiritual experience of trying to, this cleansing ritual from this person that you love or whatever. And I feel like a similar thing happens here, where, in the same way that I was talking about the sort of the concrete, literal process of playing a cello gets us to the metaphorical stuff. It's also the profane, like, not in the negative way, but just in the kind of the fleshy, the body, the sex of life is what gets us to the sacred cries of saints. For one, it's violent. There's a violence to how this is happening. It speaks from the core of the tree's hacked out heart. Hacked out is so good, and hacked out heart is perfect, but it's like it's like a double personification of the tree and then the cello. The tree has a heart that's being hacked to bits, and then that's being shaped and smoothed like a woman, which has its own sort of gendered violence in it, I think, sort of assumed, where something is done to a woman to shape and smooth her into like sort of like a kind of socialization, or whatever, gender roles or something. You could go in a whole direction there, but there's that kind of force to it. And then we have every day the cello is taken to someone's arms, taken between spread legs, and lured into its shivering. And so there's this kind of sexual act, or sensual act at the very least, that sort of produces the sacred cries of saints and demons. So I love how that's all working together. And it seems like just such another great example of this relationship between things we might consider opposite, the profane and the sacred, or the divine and the carnal, or whatever, that are actually one sort of leads right to the other.
Definitely. And I think that's the overlay operating in the poem, is that art or other things that would be categorized as worldly can still be a window into the sacred, that it's not just the purview of some kind of explicitly religious experience. Yeah, Smooth Like a Woman, I agree, has this like potential gendered violence. I think there's also a long history of people being very obnoxious about the shapes of instruments. You'll see people describe guitars as shaped like women, even though they are clearly a dick. Not really. It's just kind of like decide what you want to see. It's probably guitar shaped. But the same is the thing with the cello, where it's like, ooh, it is shaped like a woman. It is so seductive. Get out of here, old dudes who play cellos. One reading that could be explicitly sexual, which I think also ties into the idea of this maybe being the featured part for the cello, because a lot of times solos, particularly improvised solos or ones that are done live or in more popular music, particularly like a rock guitar solo or something, they kind of start off and they gain an intensity, and then there's like a really intense time in the solo, and then it kind of tapers back into the song. I think we all can make some connections from that. But I think like explicitly,
All right, Jack,
if you
say it.
It's like sex. Solos are like sex, sort of.
There's a climax.
There's a climax. Well, there's a climax in the poem too, so I'm going to get to that in a second.
Oh, okay, all right.
But yeah, no, So with the cello, we're introduced that it insists you're dying, which, if you're doing a sexual reading of the poem, Le Petit Mort, or the Little Death, right there, you're getting clued in. The hacked out heart, shaped and smooth like a woman, be glad you're not hard wood.
Yeah.
So I think particularly the juxtaposition of smooth like a woman and hard wood as the two ends of those lines is pointing you pretty strongly in a direction. I underlined those, and next to it wrote woof, because I felt like I was being bowled over by the raw animal lust in this poem. A little bit. Anyway, and then the next stanza gets us into that it is taken in someone's arms, embracing, and then taken between spread legs. It's not taken between legs, it's spread legs, which is again, as you're saying, that's the literal description of the mechanics of playing a cello, but it has some pretty clear, like you spread your legs and it's sex. And then after the spread legs, it's lured into its shivering, which I think could very well be read as the climax. You're doing the work to make it get excited. And the next description is the arm saws and saws, which again, I think could be pretty sexual, as something to do with your arms. And it is that sawing that brings forth from the cello both the literal sounds that it's making, but the way those are described is as the sacred cries of saints and demons and these moans issuing from a pit. Again, very sexual descriptors of the sounds of the cello. So I think there's a lot of very explicitly sexual language. I mean, as you were saying, it could just be sensual, but I feel like it's at some points pushed beyond just the sensual into the explicitly more sexual. And that's how I read the poem.
Yeah, I read it too. I agree with that. Yeah, and the hardwood is also, it's on the end of a line and the end of a stanza. It's so the sentence is, be glad you are not hardwood yourself and can hear it. If that was all in one line, one could be forgiven for just thinking, it would be more reasonable to say, well, that's just a description of, be glad you're not a piece of like cello and have
or a piece that was discarded to make the cello.
Yeah, be glad you're not a tree and have ears and can hear it, which is like on the one hand the kind of meaning of it. But because hardwood is jammed, it's like, okay, you just are left with that image before you actually know sort of where it's going, what the point of it is. and its closeness to shaped and smooth like a woman, I think, is right. It is interesting to think about, though, if we think about the sexual connotation of that, but then with what the sentence means, and maybe this is an overread, but like, be glad you are not hardwood yourself and can hear it. Part of me think it's like, be glad you're not a you're not a man and can hear it, or something. Like, I wonder, well, in my most extreme overread, it's like a dig about men not being able to appreciate something about, like, this spiritual divine experience. In a less aggressive overread, it's like, be glad in some ways that you're not in the sexual act yourself for this moment or something, and can sort of like experience the music or the whatever, like from a distance, and so are able to appreciate it, I suppose. Or it could be like, I don't know, it's kind of like you want to be, maybe it's like, be glad you are, but then at the same time, it is just be glad that you're human and are not, a piece of tree. But it was curious that, the it's like, I felt clear about the connotation of hardwood, and I felt clear about the literal meaning of the sentence. But then when I was like, well, if we think our both are happening, like, what does that do to the connotative meaning of the sentence? And I went some strange places, but I had no idea if you were thinking about that at all.
A little bit. As you were saying, it was the enjambment more than anything that had me thinking about the more connotative meaning, or giving more importance to the connotative meaning, because it is pointing it out.
One thing that is also, which we've sort of talked about, one of my last thoughts is, there's like something done to it kind of throughout, and I don't know where this goes, but we've talked a little bit about the violence, or the fact that, but there's the hacked out heart that it's speaking from the core of. It's shaped and smoothed like a woman. The cello is taken into someone's arms. It's not going. It's not going itself into someone's arms, right?
Call up Liam Neeson. Got to rescue this cello.
That's true. For all you parents out there, don't let your cello go on a Euro trip. It's not going to go well.
Don't let your cello follow you two around Europe. The conceit of the first Taken movie. A 17-year-old in 2000 and whatever teen is going to go follow you two around Europe.
Full truth, though. I know a family. I had a friend who was going to go to Europe in high school, and her dad saw Taken and canceled the trip.
Oh my God.
Is
art imitating life imitating art.
I know. At any rate.
But there is violence in the poem. And in fact, I asked a friend of mine to read this just to sort of see what she thought. And her takeaway is that it felt to her like an act of sexual violence was being described.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is like, it's taken into its arms. It's lured into, lure is such a predatory word, right? And then saw is so, I mean, saw as the description for sawing the bow, that makes sense, but it's like the cutting also, it echoes back to the hacked out heart and the tree, and so there is a real like, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's a very plausible reading. It's certainly being coerced, into producing this moan, right?
It's an often unexplored tension, I think, that is being brought up when you have an inanimate object that we often imbue with so many human characteristics, And usually that's only done in a laudatory way. And it's like exciting and cool that this, hunk of wood can be so moving and emotional, but actually it also has no choice. And there's like something kind of dark going on there. And that almost never gets brought up. And that's part of what I feel like is getting drawn out here. That's another really cool thing this poem has going on in it, which isn't very long, but like contains so much stuff.
Yeah. Oh my God, so much. Yeah, I mean, it reminds me a little bit. I actually just listened to our good friends Fiction on Fiction podcast, and yeah, their episode that had Madeline Miller and was going to have Emily Wilson, but was about the Odyssey. And Madeline Miller had written a sort of a novel that was about the character Circe from the Odyssey. That was like a bit part that sort of she expanded into a novel. And then they also talked about Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey as the first woman who's ever, like, it seems like officially translated it. And yeah, there were just a lot. I mean, it was a great episode, but there are lots of interesting, sexual violence is like the center that all Greek myth kind of revolves around, which was something that they talk about. But then there's also this tension, and this is more like the Metamorphoses by Ovid, but this kind of like transformation of women into trees or, ponds or flowers, or there's lots of that kind of going on. And it just made me think about like, that feels somewhat similar to the way that the cello is being talked about, like this kind of powerful but agencyless object that is wanted by people or something, or lusted for, but in a way that's like pretty problematic. And yeah, that's even going further back than Romanticism. So I really started from geez.
I love it. I think it's great. And what I really like is that this poem is in conversation with this idea that's been around for a long time, which is that when you have something that is so hugely impactful, it might be overall a positive for you, but the reason it's so impactful is because it is balancing this great light and great darkness, this great virtue and great, terror, or, it's the fact that it contains both of those things that makes it have that impact. And just thinking for me personally, anytime I've had an experience similar to this, it's because whatever exceptional thing I'm witnessing is balanced by like overcoming adversity, or, there's both the greatness of what's going on, but it's great because of the potential darkness. And I think that is just another way in which this poem is really cool.
Yeah, I agree. Should we read it again?
Yeah, let's do it. Carnegie Hall Rush Seats by Mary Karr. Whatever else the orchestra says, the cello insists. You're dying. It speaks from the core of the tree's hacked out heart, shaped and smoothed like a woman. Be glad you're not hard wood yourself and can hear it. Every day, the cello is taken into someone's arms, taken between spread legs and lured into its shivering. The arm saws and saws, and all the sacred cries of saints and demons issue from the carved cleft holes. Like all of us, it aches, sending up moans from the pit we balance on the edge of.
This is co-host Jack Rossiter Munley. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, leave a review. 5 stars maybe? Those reviews help with the algorithm and are a great way for us to find new listeners. And you can put anything in them. You can write whatever you want. You can just say, oh, this is a good podcast. I like this podcast. You could be like, hey, that Connor guy, he makes a lot of good points. Jack, why is he doing this outro so long? You know, get him off the mic. And whatever you feel like writing, head on over there, 5 stars, drop in the review. Do you have thoughts about this poem? Is there a poem or poet you'd like us to cover on a future episode? Well, we'd love to hear from you. And there are tons of ways that you can get in touch with us. I mean, I guess you could drop it into an iTunes review. You could be like, 5 stars. Hey, why don't you talk about insert name of poet here? But you can also send us an email. That's probably the best way to do it. closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com is our email address. Or you can find us on Twitter. I am at Jack Rossiter Munn. Connor is at Connor M. Stratton. And the show is at Close Talking. On Instagram, you can find us there too. We are at Close Talking Poetry, and we are on Facebook at facebook.com/Close Talking. We haven't gotten to TikTok yet, and we might never. Who knows? Anything's possible. Speaking of all those social media platforms, a very special thank you to our incredible social media manager, Corey Chena, who keeps us active across the internet. And a thank you to all of you for listening. We will see you next time.